The moment Evelyn Mercer stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1878, she made herself a promise that she intended to keep with every last stubborn bone in her body. She would never again let a man decide her fate. The dust rose up around her boots like a greeting she had not asked for, and the heat pressed down from a sky so wide and blue it seemed almost indecent after the gray, cramped streets of St. Louis. She stood there on the packed earth of the main thoroughfare, a battered leather trunk at her feet and a carpet bag clutched in both hands, taking in the rough-hewn storefronts and the smell of horse and iron and something frying in lard somewhere nearby. Caldwell was a cattle town, a border town, a town that sat right at the edge of the Indian Territory to the south and didn't particularly apologize for the wildness that proximity implied. It was exactly the kind of place a woman with a plan and no patience for sentiment needed to be. Evelyn was 26 years old, brown-haired and sharp-eyed, with a jaw that people who loved her called determined and people who did not called stubborn. She had a letter in her carpet bag from a Dr. Harold Sims, who had been the only physician in Caldwell for 11 years and who had written to the Missouri Medical College in St. Louis with a request that they send him a trained nurse willing to work in difficult conditions for modest pay. The college had passed the letter along to Evelyn, who had read it twice, packed her trunk that same evening, and written back to Dr. Sims to say she was coming. She had not waited for a reply. In St. Louis, she had left behind a fiancé named Gerald Pratt, who had been charming right up until the moment he was not, and a mother who wept at the station platform and told her that no decent woman moved to the territories alone. Evelyn had kissed her mother's cheek, handed her a handkerchief, and boarded the train west without looking back, not because she did not love her mother. She loved her mother very much, but she had learned, at considerable cost, that staying in a place because it was familiar was not the same as being safe there, and she had learned that lesson in the particular and irreversible way that left marks a person carried with them, whether they wanted to or not. Gerald had been the kind of man who believed that a woman's intelligence was something to be managed rather than celebrated. He had been charming at dinner parties and cold in private, and in the 2 years she had spent believing she understood him, she had slowly made herself smaller and quieter and less certain of everything she had once known clearly. When she had finally ended the engagement 8 months ago, he had told her she would regret it and that no one else would want a woman who thought too much of herself. She had walked out of his drawing room and down his front steps and all the way home through the cold November streets, and by the time she reached her mother's house she had been shaking, but not from the cold. She was done shaking now. Dr. Sims' office was easy enough to find. It was one of the few buildings in Caldwell with a painted sign and glass in the windows. The doctor himself was a round, red-faced man in his 50s, with spectacles pushed up onto his forehead, and the distracted air of someone who had too many things to do and not enough hours in which to do them. He looked up from his desk when she came through the door and blinked at her for a moment as though she were something he had ordered from a catalog and had not quite expected to actually arrive. "Miss Mercer," he said, rising from his chair with the slow effort of a man whose knees had opinions about it. "I prefer Mrs. Mercer," Evelyn said, which was not true in any legal sense but which she had decided to say because it was simpler. "I am told you need a nurse." He did. He needed one desperately, and he was not too proud to say so. His previous nurse, a capable woman named Mrs. Flanders, had married a rancher the previous autumn and moved 40 miles south, and since then Dr. Sims had been managing alone, which at his age and with his knees was not sustainable. Caldwell had a transient population of cowboys driving cattle up the Kishom Trail, a permanent population of merchants and families, and a surrounding countryside of homesteaders, and all of them got sick and hurt themselves with remarkable consistency. He showed Evelyn the examination room, the supply room, and the small back room with a cot and a washstand where she could sleep for the first month until she found proper lodgings. She looked at the cot, and at the single window that looked out onto the alley behind the building, and at the hook on the wall where she could hang her coat, and she said, "This will do perfectly." She got to work the following morning. The first week was an education in the particular demands of frontier medicine. She set a broken wrist for a boy who had fallen from a fence. She cleaned and bandaged a knife wound on a trail hand who would not look her in the eye and kept apologizing for being trouble. She held the hand of a woman in difficult labor while Dr. Sims delivered twins, both of whom arrived howling and healthy at 2 in the morning, and she walked home through the dark Main Street at 4 o'clock with the sky beginning to lighten in the east and felt something inside her chest unclench for the first time in years. She was useful here. She was genuinely, concretely useful, and no one was asking her to be quieter or smaller or less certain. Dr. Sims deferred to her on matters of nursing with a directness that she found almost startling after the careful condescension she had grown accustomed to. He said things like, "What do you think about that fever, Mrs. Mercer?" And then listened to the answer. She found lodgings at the end of her second week, a room above Mrs. Clara Hensley's dry goods store on the main street, with a window that looked east over the prairie and a landlady who was brisk and sensible and made excellent biscuits on Sunday mornings. Clara Hensley was a widow in her 40s who had been running the dry goods store alone since her husband died of pneumonia 3 years prior, and she and Evelyn recognized each other immediately as the kind of women who got things done without making a production of it. They were not demonstratively warm with each other at first, but within a month they were sharing the Sunday biscuits and an honest conversation in the way that women who trust each other do. It was through Clara that Evelyn first heard the name Jacob Rhodes. "The Rhodes outfit is bringing a herd up from Texas," Clara said one Sunday morning in early May, spreading butter across a biscuit with the focused attention she gave to most tasks. "Should be here inside the week. Jacob Rhodes runs it now since his father passed. He is a decent man." "Is he?" Evelyn said, with the polite lack of interest she applied to most conversational mentions of men. "He is," Clara said, and gave her a brief sideways look that Evelyn chose not to examine too carefully. "He buys his trail supplies here, and he always pays a fair price and does not haggle over it, which is more than I can say for some. He brought his man Fletcher in to see the doctor last fall after a rattlesnake got him. He sat with that cowboy all night in your waiting room until the doctor said he was going to be all right." "That speaks well of him," Evelyn said, and meant it and ate her biscuit and thought nothing more of it. The Rhodes outfit arrived on a Thursday afternoon in the second week of May, and Evelyn knew they were coming before she saw them because she could hear them. The low sustained sound of several hundred cattle moving through a town that accommodated this passage with the resigned familiarity of long practice. She was standing at the window of the examination room repacking the supply cabinet when the sound reached her, and she glanced out and saw the dust rising at the south end of the street, and watched for a moment with the mild curiosity of someone who had learned in 2 months to find the rhythms of a cattle town genuinely interesting. She did not pay particular attention to any of the riders. She went back to the supply cabinet. Jacob Rhodes walked through the door of Dr. Sims' office the following morning. She was at the front desk transcribing the doctor's patient notes into the ledger, a task Dr. Sims did badly and she did well, and which she had quietly taken over when the door opened and she looked up. He was tall, lean in the way that men who work outdoors become lean, with dark hair that needed cutting, and a jaw that was carrying 3 days of trail dust along with 3 days of beard. He wore a battered hat and working clothes and boots that had seen considerable use. He was perhaps 30 years old, perhaps a year or two more. He had the kind of face that was not pretty but was very much worth looking at, with lines at the corners of his eyes from squinting into the sun and a mouth that seemed like it spent more time in serious consideration than in easy smiling. He held his hat in his hands when he came through the door, which Evelyn noted. "Morning," he said. I am looking for the doctor. I have a man with a bad hand. Got it caught in a rope 2 days out. Dr. Sims is at the Miller homestead for a delivery, Evelyn said, setting down her pen. He will be back this afternoon. I am Mrs. Mercer, his nurse. Let me have a look at the hand. He studied her for a moment with the kind of frankness that was not rude but was appraising, and then he said, "All right," and went to get his man. The man he brought back was named Pete Dawson, a weathered trail hand in his 40s with a hand that was swollen to nearly twice its size and showing the red lines at the wrist that Evelyn recognized immediately and did not like the look of. She had Pete sit in the examination chair, and she examined the hand with careful thoroughness, asking him when it had happened, and whether the rope had broken skin, and whether he had any fever, and Pete answered each question with the stoic brevity of a man who did not want to make a fuss. Jacob Rhodes stood by the door and watched, which Evelyn was aware of in the way she was aware of most things in the room, as information rather than distraction. "The infection has started tracking," she said. "Those red lines. It needs to be cleaned properly and treated immediately. He needs to stay off that hand and he needs to be watched for fever over the next 48 hours. I can begin the treatment now and Dr. Sims can assess him this afternoon." "Will he lose the hand?" Jacob asked. His voice was quiet and even. "Not if we treat it now and he rests." She looked at Pete. "Are you willing to rest?" Pete looked at Jacob. "You are resting," Jacob said, without any particular inflection, and Pete looked back at Evelyn and said, "Yes, ma'am." She worked on Pete's hand for the better part of an hour, cleaning it and applying a poultice and wrapping it with clean linen, talking Pete through each step in the matter-of-fact conversational way she had developed with patients who were in pain and pretending not to be. When she was done, she told him to sit in the waiting area and not move, and she went to wash her hands at the basin and became aware that Jacob Rhodes was still there. "What do I owe you?" he asked. "Dr. Sims sets the fees," she said. "He will be back this afternoon." "I will wait," Jacob said, and sat down in one of the chairs by the window in a way that suggested he was entirely comfortable being still, which Evelyn found slightly unusual in a man who made his living in constant motion. She went back to her ledger. After a moment, Jacob said, "You are from back east." "Missouri," she said, without looking up. "That is not so far." "Far enough," she said, and there was something in the way she said it that was not an invitation to continue, and he heard it clearly because he did not continue. "Doctor." Sims came back at 2 in the afternoon, examined Pete Dawson's hand, agreed completely with Evelyn's assessment and treatment, and told Jacob that the charge was $1.50. Jacob paid without comment, made arrangements for Pete to stay in Caldwell for the required days of rest, and took his leave with a brief nod to Evelyn that she returned with equal brevity. She thought that was the end of it. It was not. Jacob came back the following day to check on Pete, and the day after that, and each time he came he would ask after Pete, and then he would linger, not intrusively but in the way of a man who found the place agreeable. On the third day he brought a small bag of coffee from Clara Hensley's store and set it on the front desk, and said that he had noticed the doctor's office seemed to be running low, which was true, and which Evelyn had noticed herself. She looked at the coffee and then at him. "That is very considerate," she said, with the tone she used when she was not certain whether she was being courted or simply treated with ordinary human kindness. Jacob seemed to hear the uncertainty in it, because the corners of his eyes creased slightly, not quite a smile, and he said, "Mrs. Mercer, I have a trail to finish and cattle to deliver, and I am leaving day after tomorrow. I'm not trying to make a nuisance of myself. I just noticed the coffee." "Thank you," she said, and meant it more straightforwardly the second time. He left day after tomorrow, as he had said he would, and Pete Dawson went with him, his hand significantly improved and wrapped in clean linen, and Evelyn watched the outfit move out from the window of the supply room and felt the particular quiet that settles over a place when something that had been making noise has stopped. She went back to work. But the town of Caldwell was not large, and the Kishom Trail ran straight through it, and the cattle season ran from spring through early fall, which meant that trail outfits came and went with a regularity that gave the town its particular rhythm. Evelyn learned to navigate that rhythm. She learned the difference between trail hands who were looking for trouble and trail hands who were simply loud. And she learned which saloons had the worst fights on Saturday nights and which were merely rowdy. And she learned to read the particular exhaustion in the faces of men who had been on the trail for 6 weeks when they came in for treatment. She had been in Caldwell for 3 months when she encountered Jacob Rhodes again. It was August, and the heat was the particular relentless kind that the Kansas summer produced, and Evelyn was on her way back from the Miller homestead. She had begun accompanying Dr. Sims on some of his house calls, which he appreciated and which she found valuable, when her horse stepped wrong in a rut in the road, and she had to pull up quickly to keep from being thrown. She got down to check the horse's foreleg, which seemed fine, and when she stood back up, she found that the wheel of the buggy had dropped into the rut and was sitting at an angle that was going to require more leverage than she possessed alone to free. She was standing in the road considering her options with the level practicality that she brought to most problems when she heard hooves coming from the south and looked up to find Jacob Rhodes riding toward her with 2 other men behind him. He pulled up when he reached her. "Trouble," he said. "The wheel is in a rut," she said. "I need something to use as a lever." He was off his horse before she finished the sentence, and one of the men behind him, a young cowboy with red hair and freckles, jumped down as well, and the 2 of them found a piece of fallen fence rail in the grass beside the road, and within 5 minutes had the buggy wheel free and the horse calmed and the whole situation resolved. "Thank you," Evelyn said. She looked at Jacob. "You are back." "Second drive of the season," he said. He was looking at her with that same direct, unhurried attention he had given her in the office, and she found it no less difficult to categorize the second time. It was not the look that Gerald had given her, which had always had something possessive and measuring in it. This was something different. It was more like the way she herself looked at things she was genuinely curious about. "How is Pete Dawson's hand?" she asked. "Good as ever," Jacob said, and this time the almost smile went further, and she saw what it looked like when it arrived, which was worth seeing. He rode into town behind her buggy, which she found slightly unnecessary since the road was fine the rest of the way, and she found she did not particularly object to it. The second drive delivered cattle and then lingered in Caldwell for several days while Jacob conducted business with the buyers, and during those days he appeared at the doctor's office twice more, once with a trail hand who had a bad tooth and once, on the last afternoon, alone. He came in the late afternoon when Dr. Sims had gone home, and the office was quiet, and Evelyn was sorting through the supply inventory and compiling a list for Clara Hensley's store. She heard the door and looked up, and something happened in her chest that she identified promptly and chose to set aside. "The doctor is gone for the day," she said. "I know," Jacob said. He was holding his hat again. He seemed to always hold his hat when he came in here, as though it were a deliberate thing. "I wanted to talk to you." "About what?" she said, with the careful neutrality of someone who suspected the answer. He was quiet for a moment in the way of a man choosing his words with genuine intention rather than performing consideration. "I wanted to say that I have been thinking about you since May, and I do not say that to make you uncomfortable. I say it because I think you are the kind of woman who would rather have a straight sentence than a carefully managed one." Evelyn set down her pen. "That is accurate," she said slowly. "I am going back to Texas after this drive," he said. "I have a ranch south of San Antonio. I will be back up the trail in the spring." He paused. "I would like to write to you if you would permit it. Nothing improper. I just would like to know how you are getting along." She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the directness of him and the steadiness, and the way he was not leaning forward with the eager pressing quality that men sometimes had when they wanted something, but was simply standing there and making his request and would accept whatever she said. "You may write," she said. The smile arrived completely for the first time, and she catalogued it carefully. He left the following morning, and she stood at her window and watched the outfit go south. And then she went downstairs and told Mrs. Hensley at the store that she would need her mail brought up when it arrived, which Clara received with a small satisfied nod and said nothing about at all, which Evelyn appreciated. The first letter arrived in October, carried on the mail stage from San Antonio, and it was 3 pages in a hand that was better than she expected, neat and clear, if somewhat economical. He wrote about the ranch, which he had inherited from his father 2 years prior and which he had been working to expand, about the land and the season and a problem he had been having with a section of fence on the north pasture. He wrote about a book he had been reading which surprised her, and he asked about her work. He did not ask about her personal life, about whether she had family or history she wanted to share. He asked about her work. She wrote back. She wrote 4 pages and surprised herself with how easily they came. She wrote about the twin girls born in August and about the homesteader from the Czech settlement 15 miles east who had come in with a broken arm from a barn raising gone wrong and had attempted to communicate entirely in Czech until his son rode in to translate. She wrote about the first frost and the way the prairie looked in October, which she found unexpectedly beautiful. She wrote about a medical journal she had ordered from back east and what she thought of the articles in it. She did not write about Gerald Pratt or about St. Louis or about why she had come to Caldwell. Not yet. The letters continued through the fall and into the winter, arriving at irregular intervals that depended on the stage schedule and the weather. His were consistently 3 to 4 pages. Hers were consistently more. He read everything she wrote, she knew, because he referenced it not by way of showing off but in the natural way of a conversation that continued across distance. He remembered what she said. He thought about it. He responded to it honestly. In December she wrote to him about Gerald. Not everything, but enough, that she had been engaged to a man in St. Louis who had diminished her over the course of 2 years in the particular quiet way that left no visible marks, and that coming to Caldwell had been her reclamation of herself, and that she did not tell him this to elicit sympathy, but because she thought he deserved an honest accounting of why she was the way she was, which was watchful and careful, and not inclined to trust quickly. He wrote back within 2 weeks of receiving it. He wrote that he understood more than she might expect, that his father had been a man of controlling temperament, who had run the ranch and the family with an iron certainty that had taken Jacob years to unlearn, and that he knew something about the work of becoming yourself after spending time inside someone else's idea of who you should be. He wrote that he respected her watchfulness and her care, and that he was not in a hurry, and that in his experience things worth having were worth waiting for. She read that letter sitting at the small desk in her room above Clara's store, with the winter wind pushing against the east-facing window, and she sat with it for a long time before she folded it and put it with the others in the box she kept on the windowsill. Spring came to Caldwell the way it always did, with a sudden dramatic rush after a last cold week in February, the prairie erupting into green and the wind shifting to the south, and the first of the trail outfits appearing on the horizon. Evelyn had been in Caldwell nearly a year, and she had become, in that year, someone the town knew and valued. Dr. Sims deferred to her in nursing matters so completely that she had effectively begun managing half the office's operations. Mrs. Hensley had become a genuine friend. She knew the homesteaders by name, the merchants' children, the women of the town who came to her with things they could not quite bring to the doctor. She had made herself a life that was genuinely hers, built from her own competence and her own decisions, and she was proud of it. She was also, she admitted to herself in the quiet of February evenings, looking forward to the spring in a specific and particular way that had nothing to do with the weather. The Rhodes outfit arrived in Caldwell in the 3rd week of April, 1879. She did not see Jacob arrive. She was in the middle of setting a child's broken collarbone when she heard the cattle in the street, and she finished her work with the child and his weeping mother before she went to the window. She did not go looking. She finished her day's work and closed up the office and walked to Clara's store to collect her mail, and when she came back out onto the boardwalk, he was standing there. He was dustier than she remembered and thinner in the face, and he had the particular aliveness about him that he had had when she first saw him, like someone who spent time in open country and brought something of it back with him. He was holding his hat. "Mrs. Mercer," he said. "Mr. Rhodes," she said. They looked at each other for a moment that had something in it that all the letters had been building toward, and then Jacob said, "I have been on the trail for 5 weeks, and I am standing here in the middle of the street still covered in the evidence of it. Would you do me the honor of having supper with me tomorrow evening, after I have had a chance to address that situation?" It was the first time she laughed with him, a real laugh, not polite, not careful, and she said, "Yes, I believe I would." She wore her green dress to supper, the one she had bought at Clara's store in December and had not yet worn anywhere that justified it. They ate at the hotel dining room, which was the best Caldwell had to offer and which was perfectly decent, and they talked for 3 hours over the meal and the coffee after it. They talked about his ranch, which he described with a particular loving attention that told her what kind of man he was. They talked about a case she had handled in the winter, a young woman from the Homesteads who had come in alone and frightened, and whom Evelyn had helped with a frankness and practical care that the woman had clearly not expected to find in a doctor's office. They talked about books and about the changing nature of the cattle trade, and about what the territories might look like in 10 years if the homesteaders kept coming. He was intelligent, not in a showy way, not in the way that men sometimes were when they wanted to demonstrate it, but in the quiet working way of someone who thought about things because thinking about things mattered. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, it was worth listening to. At the end of the evening, he walked her to the door of Clara's store and stood on the boardwalk and said, "I have been looking forward to this for 6 months." "So have I," she said, which was the truest thing she had said in a conversation full of true things, and she said it without the careful measuring she usually applied to honesty, just said it directly and let it sit in the evening air between them. He looked at her for a moment with something that was not quite the composed steadiness she had come to expect from him, something a degree warmer, a degree more unguarded, and he said, "Good night, Evelyn." And it was the first time he had used her name, and she took it inside with her and turned it over in the dark before she slept. The drive was staying in Caldwell for several days to complete the sale of the cattle and resupply, and Jacob appeared at the doctor's office the next morning with no particular medical pretext, and simply asked if she wanted to walk to the edge of town after the office closed, to see the prairie in the evening light. She found that she did. They walked out along the road that ran east from Caldwell into the homestead country, past the last buildings and into the open grass, and the evening was warm, and the sky was doing the extraordinary things that the Kansas sky did in late spring, painting itself in colors that Evelyn, having grown up under city skies, still found slightly shocking in their extravagance. She had her hat in her hand, and the wind was lifting her hair slightly at the temples, and she was acutely aware of how alive everything felt, the grass and the sky and the man walking beside her. "Tell me about the ranch," she said. "Tell me what it looks like." And he did, in a way that was not like the letters, which had been careful and considered, but was instead immediate and present, as though he were seeing it while he spoke. The land along the Guadalupe River south of San Antonio, the live oak trees along the creek bottoms, the way the light came through the cedar in the morning, the particular character of the grass in different seasons. He spoke about it the way she had heard some men speak about their wives, with a love that was completely unself-conscious because it had never once doubted itself. "You love that land," she said. "I do," he said. "I grew up on it. I know every piece of it." He paused. "My father ran it like a battlefield. Everything was in order. The land, the cattle, the men, my mother before she died. I swore when it came to me that I would run it differently." He was quiet for a moment. I think the land knows the difference. Evelyn looked out at the prairie and thought about a man who talked to his land, who believed the land knew him back, and she thought that this was not the kind of man she had been afraid of. My mother used to say that a place takes on the character of the people who tend it, she said. She was talking about gardens, but I think she was right about larger things too. I think so too, Jacob said. They stood at the edge of the road where the prairie grass was long and bending in the evening wind, and the sun was low and golden, and the sky above them was a deep rich blue moving toward violet at the edges, and Jacob turned to look at her with the full unhurried attention that she had catalogued carefully every time he gave it. Evelyn, he said, I want to be honest with you. I am not a man who has had a great deal of practice being easy with people. I was raised in a house where things were not said, and I spent a lot of years learning to say them. I am still learning, but I am sure about this, about you, and I think you deserve to know that. She looked back at him steadily because that was what she did. She did not look away from things that mattered. I appreciate your honesty, she said, and I will give you mine. I am not easy to love. I am stubborn and I have opinions about everything, and I do not intend to stop working, and I will not be managed. If those things are problems, better to know it now. None of those things are problems, he said. They are the specific reasons I have been thinking about you since May of last year. The silence after that was different from silences before it, and the prairie moved around them in the golden evening light. And Evelyn thought about the woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in this town a year ago and had made herself a promise about men and fate. And she thought that there was a distinction, an important one, between letting someone else decide your fate and choosing something freely, with your eyes open and your mind clear. She chose freely to take a step closer to Jacob Rhodes. He was very still for a moment, and then he raised his hand and very carefully, in the way of a man who understood that careful meant something, tucked a strand of hair back from her face. His hand was warm and rough, and it rested for just a moment at her temple, and she let it. All right, she said softly. It was not an ending. It was a beginning, and they both knew it. That evening, walking back through the darkening town with Jacob beside her, Evelyn felt something she had almost forgotten existed beneath the careful armor she had built around herself, the particular warmth of being seen by someone who was not trying to diminish what they saw. The following days were full of the ordinary business of Caldwell. Evelyn had her work, and Jacob had his preparations for the return drive. But they found time in the evenings, taking the East Road again or sitting on the bench outside Clara's store in the long spring dusk, talking with the easy depth that their letters had already established. There was a quality to their conversation that Evelyn had not experienced before, a sense of genuine exchange rather than performance, and she found herself saying things she had not known she needed to say until the moment she said them. She told him about her mother, about the particular sorrow of a woman who had poured herself entirely into the vessel of a marriage and a household, and who then could not understand why her daughter refused to do the same. She was not angry about it, or rather, she had been angry and had worked through it and arrived at something more like tenderness, but it mattered, and she wanted him to understand it. Jacob listened. He did not rush to reassure her or to fix what did not need fixing. He simply listened, and at the end he said, "She sounds like someone who did the best she knew how with the understanding she had." "She does," Evelyn agreed, "and so did I, staying as long as I did. But I know better now." "We usually do after," he said, with a rueful quality that told her he was speaking from his own experience, and she thought again about the father he had described, the iron certainty, the battlefield management of everything in reach, and she felt a recognition that moved something in her. "We do," she said. "That is the one good thing about the hard parts. After them you know more." On the last evening before the drive left Caldwell on its return south, Jacob brought her a small carved figure, a horse, cut from cedar wood, small enough to fit in a palm. He said he had made it during the evenings on the trail north, which meant he had made it before he arrived, before he had seen her again, and she held it in her hand and understood the full weight of what that meant. "I will write," he said. "I know," she said. "I will write back." He kissed her then for the first time, gently and briefly in the evening light on the boardwalk outside Clara's store, and she kissed him back with the full conscious intention of someone who made deliberate choices. And when he pulled back and looked at her, she was already looking at him. "Spring," he said. "Spring," she agreed. He left the next morning, and she watched from the window again, and the quiet settled back over Caldwell, and Evelyn went to work. The year that followed was the fullest she had lived. She worked hard at the office, taking on more of the administrative functions as Dr. Sim's knees grew more difficult, and she began doing some of the house calls alone when the doctor's schedule was full. She delivered 2 babies without the doctor present, both times successfully, and the word spread through the Homestead communities that the nurse at Dr. Sim's office was capable and steady and did not condescend. Women began coming to her directly, which she took seriously. She kept careful records, and she ordered medical literature from St. Louis, and she argued with Dr. Sims pleasantly and productively about treatment methods. And sometimes she was right and sometimes he was, and they both respected each other for it. She also wrote to Jacob twice a month, and he wrote to her with the same regularity. And the letters grew through the fall and winter into something that was quite clearly a courtship in the fullest sense, a slow, careful building of real knowledge between 2 people who both understood the value of knowing the person you were choosing. He came to Caldwell again in April of 1880, and this time there was nothing tentative about the reunion. She walked out to meet the outfit as it came up the main street, which was not something she would have done before and which she did now without any particular self-consciousness. And Jacob rode to where she was standing and swung down from his horse, and they looked at each other for a moment, and then he said, "Good evening, Evelyn," and she said, "Good evening, Jacob." And Clara Hensley was watching from the door of her store and smiling into her sleeve. Over supper that evening Jacob said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to take whatever time you need before you answer." "Ask it," she said. He set down his coffee cup and looked at her directly, and she knew what was coming and felt it arrive through her chest like a current. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want you to come to the ranch in Texas and build something there with me. I know that is a great deal to ask of a woman who has built a life here that is her own, and I am not asking you to give it up. I am asking you to build a new one, alongside me. But I know the ranch is not here and your work is here, and I will not pretend the question is simple." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She looked at the window of the hotel dining room, at the street beyond it, at the familiar shape of Caldwell in the spring evening. "I have been thinking about this since October," she said finally. "Since your letter in October when you wrote about the river and the cedar." She looked back at him. "There is no physician in that part of Texas, is there?" He blinked. "Not within 20 miles, no." "Then there is work to be done there," she said. "There has always been work to be done everywhere in this country, and Dr. Sims and I have been discussing the fact that he needs to begin thinking about his retirement within the next 2 years. He has been talking to a young doctor from back east who is interested in coming west." She paused. "I am not giving anything up, Jacob. I am taking everything I have built here and bringing it somewhere that needs it." He looked at her for a long moment with something in his face that she had never seen there before, something unguarded and luminous. "Yes," he said. "Yes," she said. The practical management of what followed occupied the better part of the remaining time in Caldwell. Evelyn had her arrangements to make, her work to transition, her life to pack into trunks again, though this time the packing felt entirely different from the packing in St. Louis. She was not leaving something she had failed to endure. She was completing something and beginning something else, and the distinction mattered enormously. She wrote to her mother, who responded with a letter that began with 3 paragraphs of anxious questions and ended with a paragraph that was, Evelyn thought, the truest thing her mother had ever written to her, that she wanted Evelyn to be happy, that she had always wanted that, and that she was sorry she had sometimes made it harder instead of easier. Evelyn wrote back and said that she knew that, and that she was happy, and that she wanted her mother to come and visit them in Texas when they were settled, and her mother wrote back and said she would. Dr. Sims said, at the announcement of her departure, that she was the best nurse he had ever had, and that the young doctor coming to replace him had no idea what a standard he was going to be held to. He said this gruffly and then blew his nose very thoroughly into his handkerchief and turned back to his desk. Clara Hensley walked Evelyn to the stagecoach on the morning of her departure and embraced her once, firmly, with the practical warmth that was entirely Clara's own. "You are the most capable woman I have ever known," Clara said, "and the most deserving of good things." She pulled back and looked at Evelyn with clear eyes. "Write to me." "Every month," Evelyn said, and she meant it, and she kept it. The journey south to San Antonio took the better part of 2 weeks on the stage route, and Evelyn arrived in Texas in June of 1880 to a heat that was different from Kansas, softer and denser, with a smell of cedar and dust and something sweet from the live oaks. Jacob met her at the stage depot in San Antonio with a wagon and a clean shirt, and a look on his face that she thought she would remember for the rest of her life. They were married 3 days later in San Antonio, in a civil ceremony that was brief and sincere, with Jacob's ranch foreman, a barrel-chested Tejano man named Domingo Vargas, as witness, and a woman named Rosa Vargas, Domingo's wife, who pressed a small bunch of wildflowers into Evelyn's hands before the ceremony and wept thoroughly and happily all the way through it. The ranch was everything Jacob's letters and words had made her believe it would be, and more. It sat in the rolling country south of San Antonio, where the Guadalupe River ran through cedar and live oak, and the grass stretched in long golden waves toward the hills, and the sky was enormous and unhurried. The house was solid cedar plank construction, larger than she had expected, with a wide porch that faced west toward the sunset and a kitchen that had been clearly and thoughtfully prepared for her arrival. There were curtains on the windows that Rosa had made and hung, and a rocking chair on the porch that was new and had been placed there for her. And when Evelyn walked through the rooms of the house, she felt the particular sensation of a space that had been thought about with care. She stood on the porch that first evening and watched the sun go down over the cedar hills, and Jacob stood beside her with his shoulder touching hers, and neither of them said anything for a long while. "It is beautiful," she said finally. "It is," he said. He turned to look at her in the last gold of the light. "It is better now." She settled into the ranch with the same practical directness she had brought to everything else she had undertaken. She learned the land, rode out with Jacob in the mornings to learn the boundaries and the water sources and the pasture rotations, and asked the kind of questions that prompted Jacob's men to look at each other with surprised respect. She established a relationship with the Vargas family, who lived in a house on the ranch property and who had worked with Jacob since his father's time, and she liked them enormously and immediately. Domingo was steady and capable and deeply loyal to Jacob. Rosa was warm and direct and kept an extraordinary kitchen garden that Evelyn admired and began learning from. Within the first month, the nearest homesteaders had heard that the new Mrs. Rhodes had nursing training, and people began appearing at the ranch house with minor injuries and ailments that had previously required the long ride to San Antonio. Evelyn treated what she could and referred what she could not, and began quietly compiling a record of the medical needs she was seeing, because she was already thinking about something larger. She wrote to Dr. Sims, and she wrote to the medical college in St. Louis, and she began a correspondence with a missionary medical society in Austin. She was building towards something, she knew. She did not yet know exactly what shape it would take. What she knew was her daily life, which was full in a way she had not anticipated. There was the ranch and its demands, which were considerable, and which she threw herself into understanding. There was the slow, careful deepening of her knowledge of the land, the way the creek looked in drought versus in rain, the behavior of the cattle in different seasons, the particular knowledge that Domingo carried about the South Pasture's grass and what it meant for the herd's condition. She absorbed all of it with the same hunger she brought to medical literature. She could not help it. She was constitutionally unable to be near things she did not understand without moving toward understanding. And there was Jacob. Jacob, who she lived beside and worked alongside and talked with every evening on the west porch with the sunset, and who turned out to be in person everything he had been in letters and more. He was patient without being passive. He was strong without needing to demonstrate it. He was funny in a dry, understated way that she found increasingly delightful, and he laughed at her own humor with a genuine appreciation that she had not realized she had been missing until she had it. He was the kind of man who showed what he felt in actions more readily than in words, but who had committed himself to the words as well, and the combination of the two, a man who showed up and also told her he was showing up, was something she had not known to ask for. In November, 6 months after the wedding, Evelyn told Jacob she was expecting. She told him in the kitchen at breakfast, matter-of-factly, because she did not know how else to deliver significant information, and because she thought directness was a form of respect. He set down his coffee cup and looked at her with that luminous, unguarded thing that came to his face at the moment she most valued, and he crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and put his arms around her carefully, as though she were both strong and precious, which she was, and held her for a moment without saying anything. Then he said against her hair, "Are you all right?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "It is a normal physiological process." He laughed, a real full laugh that she felt in his chest against her ear, and said, "Of course it is." She was, in fact, perfectly well through the pregnancy. The nausea in the first months was significant but manageable, and she continued working through all of it, adjusting her schedule to account for fatigue but refusing to be reduced to the invalid that some women were expected to become during pregnancy. Rosa watched her carefully and made her drink herbal teas with authoritative love, and Jacob watched her with a constant attentive awareness that was not smothering, was not, crucially, the controlling attention she had known in her past, but was the steady watchfulness of someone who cared deeply and was paying attention. She told him once, during the winter evenings when the cedar fire was burning and the wind was outside and they were sitting with their respective reading, that she was aware of the difference, and she wanted him to know that she was aware of it. He looked up from his book. "Between you and him," she said, and did not elaborate because she did not need to. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know about control that looks like care. I watched my father for 30 years. I think about it. I think about whether I am doing it, especially now, especially." He stopped. "I try not to." "You do not," she said. "I want you to know that, you do not." He nodded once with the gravity of someone receiving something important, and they went back to their reading, and the fire burned down, and the wind moved through the cedar outside, and Evelyn thought that this was what she had come west for, this specific thing, not just work, not just independence, but this. Their son was born in the late spring of 1881, on a warm May morning with Rosa in attendance, and Evelyn managing the whole situation with the professional calm she would have applied to any patient, and the privately staggering emotional experience of it being her. She delivered a healthy, furious 8-pound boy who announced his arrival to the entire ranch with considerable volume, and Jacob, who had been on the porch for the 2 hours of labor that Evelyn had firmly insisted he spend outside, came through the door when Rosa called him looking like a man who had aged 5 years and then been returned to himself all at once. He looked at Evelyn first. "Are you all right?" he said. "I am excellent," she said from the bed, with the specific glow of exhaustion and triumph. "Come and meet your son." He crossed to her and sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby into his arms, and Jacob held him with a carefulness that was overwhelming to observe, and looked down at this new person with an expression that Evelyn decided she would carry with her always, in the exact way she carried the cedar horse from the trail, as a small perfect object that meant everything it meant. They named the boy Daniel for no particular reason other than that they both liked the sound of it, and that Evelyn's grandfather had been a Daniel, and that it fit the boy's serious dark-eyed face in a way that seemed immediately correct. Daniel Rhodes was a cheerful, active baby who quickly became a cheerful, active small child with his father's dark hair and his mother's opinionated approach to everything. He walked early and talked early and had views on most subjects from an improbably young age, and Evelyn raised him with the same direct honesty she applied to everything else, explaining the world to him in plain language and answering his questions fully when he asked them, which was constantly. The ranch grew in those years. Jacob expanded the herd carefully, reinvesting in the land with the long-term commitment of a man who planned to pass it on. He hired 2 additional hands and built new fence along the north section, and the relationship with Domingo Vargas deepened into something that was essentially family. Daniel called Domingo and Rosa by the Spanish honorifics for aunt and uncle, which they had offered and which felt right. Evelyn's work grew too. By 1882, she had established an informal medical practice out of 2 rooms in the ranch house, seeing patients from the surrounding homestead communities 3 days a week. She had successfully corresponded with the Missionary Medical Society in Austin and secured a small supply grant for medicines and bandaging materials. She had begun training a young woman named Maria, one of the Vargas daughters, in basic nursing skills, which Maria proved to have a remarkable aptitude for. She had written to the Territorial Health Board in Austin about the need for medical services in rural communities south of San Antonio, and had received back a letter that was polite and not particularly interested, and had written again, more specifically, and had received a slightly more interested response, and was in the process of drafting a formal proposal. She was not certain it would come to anything immediately. She was certain she was going to keep trying. Jacob read her letters and her proposals and her medical correspondence with the same attentiveness he gave to everything she did, and occasionally offered observations that proved useful. He was not a medical man and he did not pretend to be, but he was intelligent, and he could see an argument and identify where it needed strengthening, and he was honest about it. "This paragraph here," he said one evening, going over her proposal with her at the kitchen table while Daniel slept and Rosa's herb tea sat cooling between them. "You are making the argument twice instead of once. Say it once clearly and trust it." She looked at the paragraph. He was right. She crossed out the second version and the argument was better for it. "Thank you," she said. "You built the argument," he said. "I just noticed the extra bricks." She looked at him across the table in the lamplight, this man who she had not planned for, who had arrived in her carefully constructed future with the unhurried certainty of something that belongs, and she felt the warmth of it all the way through her. "Jacob," she said. "Evelyn," he said, in the quiet, attentive way he had of saying her name. "I love you," she said, which she had said before and would say again, but which arrived each time with its full weight intact, unchanged by repetition, which she had not known was possible until it was. "I love you," he said back, immediately and entirely. "Since the first letter, since before the first letter, since you looked at Pete Dawson's hand and told me exactly what was wrong and what to do about it as though the answer were just the next thing on the list." She laughed. "That is a very specific moment. You are a very specific woman." "I am," she agreed, and she was glad of it. The proposal to the Territorial Health Board eventually bore fruit, though not in the year she sent it. It came back in 1883 with a partial approval and a small allocation of funds that was not what she had asked for but was something, and she used it to purchase additional medicines and to begin paying Maria a formal wage for her nursing assistance. She revised the proposal and sent it again the following year, and by 1884 she had a formal if modest acknowledgement from the board that the rural nursing station on the Rhodes property was serving a recognized need in the community. It was not the hospital she intended to eventually build, but it was the beginning of the path toward it, and Evelyn understood paths well enough to know that the beginning was where you started. In the spring of 1883 they had their second child, a girl this time, born in March with considerable drama and a full head of dark hair, and a loud announcement very similar to her brother's. They named her Catherine, after Jacob's mother, which made Jacob quiet and warm for a day in a way that Evelyn understood completely. Daniel, who was 2 and extremely opinionated about everything, examined his new sister from a careful distance and then pronounced her acceptable, which Rosa and Domingo took as a positive sign. The life they had built was full in every direction that mattered. The ranch ran well, the land gave back what Jacob put into it, and the cattle season each year brought the steady rhythm of preparation and drive and return that structured the year. Evelyn's work expanded steadily, patient by patient and letter by letter and proposal by proposal. Daniel grew into a solemn, curious boy who followed his father around the ranch with a small notebook writing things down, and followed his mother around the medical rooms asking questions that she answered in full detail, which he received with the careful gravity of someone filing things away for later use. Catherine grew into a child of spectacular energy and absolute confidence, who at 18 months was already applying her brother's notebook system to her own observations, which mostly consisted of detailed accounts of the ranch animals' behavior. There was an evening in the fall of 1884 when Evelyn was sitting on the west porch watching the last of the sunset fade behind the Cedar Hills, and Daniel was beside her with his notebook, and Catherine was on Jacob's lap having fallen asleep in the sudden complete way of very young children, and Jacob was sitting in the rocking chair watching the darkness come in, and the evening was full of the sounds of the ranch settling horses in the corral, the distant bellow of a cow from the south pasture, Domingo's voice somewhere near the barn giving an instruction in his steady Spanish. Evelyn looked at it all and felt a completeness that she held carefully, the way you hold something that can be damaged if you press too hard. "What are you thinking about?" Jacob asked quietly so as not to wake Catherine. "Everything," she said. "Nothing." She paused. "I was thinking about the stagecoach." He looked at her. "When I arrived in Caldwell," she said, "I stood in the street with my trunk and I made myself a promise. I told myself I would never again let a man decide my fate." Jacob was quiet, listening. "I have been thinking about whether I kept that promise," she said, "and I believe I have. I chose you. That is a different thing." She looked at him. "It matters to me that I know that." "It matters to me too," he said, "that you chose it freely." "Freely," she confirmed. The darkness was fully in now and the stars were enormous overhead in the Texas sky, and Catherine breathed the slow, even breath of deep sleep in Jacob's arms, and Daniel leaned against Evelyn's side and wrote something in his notebook in the dark by feel, which was entirely characteristic of him. "What are you writing?" Evelyn asked him. Daniel considered. "I am writing that the sky has 17 different kinds of dark in it," he said, with the complete seriousness of a 6-year-old who has thought about this carefully. "That sounds exactly right to me," Jacob said, and Evelyn agreed, and the evening settled around them all. The following year brought changes of the large kind that life in a changing country produced. The railroad had been expanding into South Texas, bringing with it the reorganization of the cattle trade that all the ranchers had been anticipating and arguing about for years. The long drives north up the Kisham Trail were ending, not all at once but gradually, the economics shifting as the rail lines made the long trail routes obsolete. Jacob had seen it coming, had been preparing the ranch's business model for the transition, and he moved through the change with the same steady forethought he brought to most things. The ranch shifted its marketing to the railhead 30 miles north, the drive shortened, the structure of the season changed. But the end of the trail drives also meant something else, something that Jacob came to Evelyn about one evening with the particular quality of a man who has been thinking hard about something and has arrived at a decision. "I want to put the main trail herd money into the land," he said. "I want to add the north section we have been looking at along the river. And I want to put capital into the property more broadly, the fencing, the water improvements, everything Domingo has been asking about." "That is a significant investment," she said. "It is," he said, "and I want to know what you think." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because this is your ranch too," he said simply. "Because you are the other half of what happens here and I want to know your thinking." She studied the numbers he had written out, asked her questions, and when she was satisfied, she said that she thought it was the right decision and that the north section was particularly well timed. And Jacob nodded once in the way of a man who had thought what she thought and was glad to have it confirmed. And the next morning he rode out to speak to the landowner about the purchase. In 1886, Evelyn received a letter from Clara Hensley in Caldwell that contained, among other news, the information that the young doctor who had taken over Dr. Sims' practice had left Caldwell for a better-paying position in Kansas City, and that Dr. Sims, who had officially retired but not entirely managed to stop working, was back to doing more than his knees could easily handle. Clara's letter did not ask Evelyn to do anything about this. It was simply information, reported with Clara's characteristically matter-of-fact brevity. Evelyn read it and then put it aside and did not stop thinking about it for a week. At the end of the week she came to Jacob with a proposal. "I want to go to Caldwell," she said, "for 3 months. Dr. Sims needs help until he can find a permanent replacement, and I know the practice and I know the town and I could have Maria managing the station here for 3 months. She is ready for it." She paused. "I want to take Daniel with me. He is 7 and it would be good for him to see something beyond the ranch." Jacob thought about this for 3 days. He was not thinking about whether to agree, she could see that clearly. He was thinking about the practical management of 3 months without her. On the 3rd day he said, "Go, take Daniel, write to me every week." She crossed the kitchen and kissed him with feeling, and he put his arms around her and held her for a moment with the particular tenderness of a man who loved someone enough to let them go do the thing they needed to do. She and Daniel went to Caldwell in June. The reunion with Clara Hensley involved genuine emotion on both sides and considerable warmth, and Daniel was immediately fascinated by everything about the town, which he documented in his notebook with characteristic thoroughness. Dr. Sims, older and slower but still formidably competent, was visibly relieved to have her back, and the first morning in the familiar office, Evelyn felt the ease of returning to a place that had once been hers. She worked hard for 3 months, managing the practice with the same diligence she had always brought to it, training 2 local women in basic medical assistance the way she had trained Maria, and writing a thorough handover guide for whatever physician came next. She also wrote to the medical college in St. Louis on Dr. Sims' behalf, more specifically and forcefully than the original request that had brought her to Caldwell, and before the 3 months were out, she had a letter back saying that a young doctor named Hartwell had expressed interest and was reviewing the position. She left Caldwell in September, having handed the practice back to Dr. Sims in better shape than she had found it, with Daniel, who was brown as a nut from the Kansas summer and full of new material for his notebooks. And she wrote to Clara Hensley from the stage depot that she would keep writing every month and that Caldwell had been everything she remembered and that she was going home. She arrived at the ranch at sunset on a September evening, and Jacob was standing on the porch, and Daniel went running from the wagon and Jacob caught him and swung him up and looked over his son's head at Evelyn coming across the yard in the last gold light, and the expression on his face was the one she had first seen in the hotel dining room in Caldwell, when she had told him that there was work to be done wherever you went. She walked up the porch steps and he put Daniel down, and Catherine came barreling out of the house making the extremely loud announcement that she had been making about most things at age 3, and Jacob's hand found Evelyn's and held it with the quiet certainty of something that did not need to prove itself. "Welcome home," he said. "Thank you for letting me go," she said. "Thank you for coming back," he said, and she knew he meant both the literal coming back from Caldwell and the larger one, the one she had chosen on the East Road out of town in the spring evening in 1879 when she had taken a step closer to him. The coming back from all the things that had made her leave St. Louis and all the careful armor and all the wariness, back to herself and to the life she had chosen. The years continued to build on each other with the steady accumulation that good lives have, year by year adding depth and dimension. The ordinary, extraordinary business of raising children and working land and loving someone well across the long span of time that reveals character fully. Daniel at 10 was a serious, scholarly boy who had decided he intended to become a doctor, a decision he had communicated with the kind of absolute certainty that made both his parents believe him. He had been Evelyn's shadow in the medical rooms for 3 years and could assist at treatments with a steady competence that several of the Homesteader patients had commented on. Jacob, who had grown up knowing exactly what he was going to do with his life, and who respected the kind of certainty that came from genuine knowledge of oneself, handled his son's determination with quiet pride and the practical question of how to give it what it needed to grow. He and Evelyn talked about San Antonio for Daniel's schooling, and about the possibility eventually of the medical college in Galveston, and about the cost of it and the timing of it, and Evelyn wrote to the medical college and got information, and they planned with the long-range seriousness of people who understood that the things worth building took time. Catherine at 8 was everything her brother was not, quick and loud and physical, who spent her days on horseback with Domingo's youngest son, Mateo, learning the ranch with the practical intelligence of someone who was going to run something someday. Jacob watched her with a mixture of recognition and delight. Evelyn watched her with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had chosen for herself, and was raising a daughter who was learning from birth that choosing for yourself was not only possible but expected. There were hard things too, because life is complete. In 1888, Evelyn lost a patient, a young homesteader woman who had come to her too late, with a fever too advanced for what Evelyn had available, and despite everything she could do, the woman died in the back room of the medical station with her husband outside and her 2 small children, and nothing Evelyn could have done differently. She sat with it for a long time afterward, in the way of someone who takes responsibility seriously, going over every decision and finding no mistakes, and accepting that medicine was not a perfect thing, and that accepting the limits of what was possible was part of doing the work honestly. Jacob found her sitting on the west porch at midnight after the family had left, and he sat beside her without asking questions, and after a while she told him what had happened and how she felt about it, and he listened to all of it without rushing to the reassurance, and then he said, "You did everything you could." "I know," she said. "I know I did. It still matters." "Yes," he said, "it does." He was quiet. "That is what makes you the kind of person people can trust with this." She looked at him. "The fact that it matters," he said. "That is not a flaw, that is the whole thing." She put her head on his shoulder and sat there in the dark, and the sound of the ranch at night moved around them, and after a while the weight of the evening shifted slightly, not gone but bearable, which was what good company did. In the summer of 1889, Evelyn's mother came to Texas. Margaret Mercer arrived at the San Antonio stage depot with 2 trunks and the expression of someone who had been gathering courage for a considerable distance and was now committed to arriving regardless. She was 62 and gray-haired and still looked like Evelyn would look in 30 years, which Jacob noted privately with the quiet pleasure of a man who expected to see that too. She was overwhelmed by the ranch, which was bigger and more vigorous than she had expected. She was slightly overwhelmed by Daniel and Catherine, who received her with the same direct quality as their mother, and had many opinions they were willing to share. She was visibly moved by the medical station and by watching Evelyn work, which she had never done before, had never seen her daughter in the specific authority of her own competence. She told Evelyn in the kitchen one evening after dinner that she was sorry she had not understood sooner. "You understood as soon as you were able to," Evelyn said, which was the true thing to say. "You would not have waited for me," Margaret said. "You would have gone anyway." "I would have," Evelyn agreed, "but I am glad you are here now." Margaret stayed for 6 weeks and left with the satisfied look of someone who had put down a worry they had been carrying for a long time. She shook Jacob's hand at the depot and said, "You are a good man," with the directness of a woman who had spent enough time at the ranch to have formed her own opinion about it, and Jacob said, "Thank you, Mrs. Mercer," and she allowed him to help her with her trunks in a way that suggested she had decided to trust him, which was the most she would ever have to give. Daniel left for school in San Antonio in 1890, which was quieter without him, and which Evelyn managed by being busier, and by writing him letters that were extremely long and detailed about the medical cases she was handling, which he received with delight and responded to with equal detail about his own studies. He was, his teachers confirmed in letters to Evelyn, exceptional. He was also, they noted, opinionated and not easily redirected from a position he believed was correct, which Evelyn read to Jacob with great satisfaction. "I wonder where he gets that," Jacob said. "It is a mystery," she agreed. Catherine, at 11, 12, 13, was becoming the kind of young person who made both her parents proud in the particular way that was not about what they had planned, but about what she had found herself to be. She was learning the ranch management with serious intention, had begun keeping her own accounts in her notebook system, and had taken to going with Evelyn on the longer house calls with the same focused attention her brother had given the medical rooms. She was not going to be a physician, Evelyn understood. She was going to be someone who ran things, who made decisions, who understood both the land and the people on it. In 1891, Evelyn's proposal to the Territorial Health Board finally received its full approval, and the funding she had been working toward for 9 years was allocated for a proper medical clinic in the community, to be built on the north edge of the Rhodes property on land Jacob donated for the purpose. It was not a hospital, not yet. It was a clinic, 2 proper rooms with good equipment and a waiting area and a wood stove. But it was built, and it had a sign on the front, and it served the homestead communities for 20 miles in every direction. Evelyn stood in front of it on the day it opened and looked at it for a long time. Jacob stood beside her. The children were there, Daniel home from San Antonio for the occasion, 18 now and already carrying the beginning of his professional manner, and Catherine at 13 standing with her hands on her hips and her mother's jaw. "What does it feel like?" Jacob asked. Evelyn thought about a woman on a stagecoach platform with a battered trunk and a promise, and a plan that had not included a single thing that had turned out to matter most. She thought about the letters and the east road out of Caldwell in the spring light, and the cedar horse on her windowsill that had been on windowsills in 3 different houses now and was still there, still perfect. "It feels like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," she said. "You got here yourself," he said. "Every step of it." "Not every step," she said, and she looked at him with the full directness that she had always given him, without armor, without management. "Some of the steps were yours." He took her hand, there in front of the clinic on the rolling Texas land, with their children beside them and the work they had built behind and ahead of them, and held it with the steady certainty that had never once wavered in the 12 years they had walked together. The clinic grew over the years, as Evelyn had known it would. She trained more nurses from among the local women, and she eventually hired a young physician from Austin who worked alongside her, and who she bullied cheerfully into keeping better records. She continued her correspondence with the Territorial Health Board and the Medical College and the Missionary Medical Society, building the web of support that made the work sustainable. She wrote articles for medical journals, the first published in 1893, on wound treatment in rural settings without hospital access, which generated considerable correspondence, and one somewhat condescending letter from a physician in Philadelphia that she responded to with meticulous precision, citing her own case records and statistics, which ended the condescension. Jacob read every article she published with obvious pride and no false modesty about it. He told her they were important, and he told her specifically why, and she valued that more than any abstract praise. In 1895, Daniel graduated from the Galveston Medical College and came home to the ranch for the summer before taking a position at a hospital in San Antonio. He was 24, tall and dark-haired and serious, with his mother's sharpness and his father's steadiness in a combination that made people trust him instinctively. He spent that summer in the clinic at his mother's side, and the things he saw in her work, the practical improvisation, the deep patient knowledge, the absolute lack of condescension shaped his practice in ways he told her about years later. Catherine at 18 was a different kind of magnificent. She had been running the ranch's account books for 2 years with Jacob's guidance, and at 18 she sat down with Domingo, who was approaching 60 and thinking about his own succession, and had a frank conversation about the future of the ranch management that Domingo reported to Jacob with great satisfaction as being the best conversation about ranch business he had had in years. She was not going to college. She had made that clear. She was going to stay on the land and know it the way her father knew it, and build on it the way he had built, and she was absolutely certain about this, which Jacob received with the full recognition of a man looking at his own certainty, reflected back at him by someone he had made. There was an evening in the fall of 1896, when the children were grown and the clinic was established, and the ranch was in full thriving maturity, when Jacob and Evelyn sat on the west porch in the cooling air after a long working day and watched the last of the light go out of the sky. The cedar hills had gone from gold to gray to the particular blue dark of early night, and the first stars were appearing in the east, and the ranch was making its evening sounds around them. Evelyn had her hands in her lap and her hair was gray at the temples now, in the distinguished way of a woman who had earned her gray hair honestly, and Jacob was 48 and worn in the way of men who have spent their lives doing physical work on land they love, and neither of them said anything for a long while because there was nothing that needed to be said in the sense of filling silence, and they both knew the difference. "Daniel wrote," Evelyn said finally. "He is seeing a young woman. A schoolteacher from Victoria. What does he say about her? He says she is intelligent and not easily redirected from a position she believes is correct," Evelyn said. Jacob made the sound that was his fullest laugh. "Then he is done for." "Thoroughly," she agreed with immense satisfaction. The evening settled deeper, and the stars multiplied overhead, and the cedar horse was inside on the windowsill of their bedroom as it had always been, and the clinic was dark at the north edge of the property, ready to open in the morning, and Catherine's lamp was on in the east room where she was doing the accounts with the focused attention she gave to everything, and the land stretched out in all directions under the enormous Texas sky and was theirs and known and beloved. Evelyn thought about everything she had planned when she came west, the work, the independence, the reclamation of herself, and how all of it had come to pass and more. She had her work and she had herself, and she had built something lasting in this place that had needed what she had to give. The plan had worked, every part of it, and then there was the part that had not been in the plan at all, sitting beside her in the dark with his hand finding hers on the arm of the rocking chair in the easy natural way of people who have spent 18 years learning the geography of each other. "Jacob," she said. "Evelyn," he said, "I have been thinking about something." "I know," he said. "You have had your thinking face on since Tuesday," she laughed. "Is it obvious?" "Only to me," he said. "Only after 18 years." She looked at him in the dark, at the familiar outline of him against the stars, at the man who had walked into the doctor's office in Caldwell in 1878 with his hat in his hands, and the specific kind of decency that she had learned to recognize from its first appearance and never had cause to doubt afterward. "I want to expand the clinic," she said. "I have been in correspondence with the health board about the county hospital proposal. Dr. Hartwell thinks the timing is right. I think if I go to Austin in the spring and present the full case in person, we have a genuine chance at the full funding." Jacob was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Tell me what you need for the presentation." She told him. He listened with the complete attention she had come to understand as one of the most constant and valuable things about him, and when she was done, he asked 3 questions that went directly to the 3 weakest points in her argument, which was exactly what she needed, and she answered 2 of them satisfactorily and admitted the third needed more work, and he said, Then we work on the third. We, she said. You write it, he said. I will tell you when the bricks are extra. She smiled in the dark, a smile that was entirely for him, and that she did not try to manage or contain. And she thought that this was what she had not planned for, not just a man who loved her, but this specific man, this specific love that gave her room to be everything she was, and asked her to take up the full measure of her own life without apology. She went to Austin in the spring of 1897, presented the full county hospital proposal with the particular forcefulness of a woman who had been building toward this for nearly 20 years, and received the approval that spring with a letter that she read 3 times standing in the corridor of the health board building before she went to the telegraph office and sent a wire to the ranch that said simply, "Approved. Coming home." Jacob was waiting at the station when she arrived, with Catherine beside him and Domingo and Rosa and all the evidence of people who had been expecting her. And when she stepped off the train, he came to her across the platform and she went to him, and he put his arms around her and she felt him laugh with relief and joy and pride against her hair. "Tell me everything," he said. "Everything," she promised, and took his arm and went home. The county hospital was built over the following 2 years on the north edge of the town that had grown up around the clinic, a proper building with 3 examination rooms and a small ward and a surgery, and a waiting room with good light from the east windows. Evelyn oversaw the construction with the same meticulous attention she gave to everything, and she oversaw the staffing and the supply protocols and the policies. And on the opening day, she stood in the doorway of the building that her work and her stubbornness and her long, careful, patient effort had built. And beside her stood Jacob, and Catherine, and Domingo and Rosa, and Dr. Hartwell and Maria Vargas, who was now a fully trained nurse and the head of the nursing staff, and various homesteaders and ranchers and their families, all the people of the surrounding country for whom this place had been built. Daniel came from San Antonio with the young woman from Victoria, whose name was Ellen, and who had the intelligent, steady quality and the somewhat challenging directness that was clearly the only kind of person Daniel was going to fall in love with, which Evelyn found completely perfect. He stood beside his mother in the doorway, and she looked at her son, who was 28 and excellent, and she thought about Pete Dawson's hand and the supply cabinet and a tall, dusty man who had come through the door of a different medical office 21 years ago. "You built this," Daniel said to her. "We built it," she said, and meant the full scope of it, the clinic and the hospital and the ranch and the family and the life that had grown from a plan that had been sound, and from something she had not planned for that had made it complete. In the years that followed, Evelyn worked in the hospital she had built and taught the nurses she had trained, and watched the work of caring for people in this hard, beautiful country go on and grow. She and Jacob grew older together on the west porch and through the working days of the ranch, and in the conversations that went on as they had always gone on, deep and honest and unfinished in the best way, always finding new things to say. Daniel married Ellen in 1900 in San Antonio, and they had a son the following year. And Evelyn and Jacob sat in the San Antonio church for the baptism with the specific joy of people who are watching something they made go forward into the world. Catherine, at 22, had the full management of the ranch accounts and was talking with Jacob about eventually taking on a full partnership in the ranch operations, which she would do, and which the ranch would thrive under, and which Domingo, now near retirement himself, told Jacob was the best thing that could happen to the land, which it was. On a winter evening in 1901, Jacob and Evelyn sat on the west porch in the cold, wrapped in heavy coats, watching the stars over the cedar hills. Their breath made small clouds in the air, and the night was very still and the ranch was quiet around them. "Are you warm enough?" Jacob asked. "I am warm enough," Evelyn said. They sat in the silence that was entirely comfortable, that had been comfortable for 23 years, the silence of 2 people who know each other fully and rest in that knowledge. Evelyn looked at the stars and thought about all the distances she had traveled, the geographic distances, and the interior ones. The long way from a woman on a stagecoach platform making a promise about her own fate to this porch, this man, this life. She had kept the promise, she thought. She had kept all of them, the one about never being managed, the one about working, the one about being fully herself. And she had found, which she had not expected, that keeping those promises had not made love impossible. It had made it the right kind possible, the kind that held. The cedar horse was inside on the windowsill. The clinic lights were dark for the night. Daniel's son was 11 months old and growing. Catherine was inside at the lamp doing accounts with the focused pleasure of someone doing exactly what they are meant to do. And Jacob's hand was in hers, as it had been in the church in San Antonio where they were married, and in the medical office in Caldwell when she had first taken the step closer to him on the East Road in the spring evening, and in every morning and evening in between, steady and certain and entirely hers. "I am glad I came west," she said. "I am glad you came west," he said. "I was going to build a good life regardless," she said. "I know," he said. "You were already doing it." "You were the part I did not plan for," she said. "Was I worth it?" He said it lightly, but she heard the real question in it, the genuine one, the same one she had asked herself about her own choices, whether they had been right, whether the future she had made was the one that was true. She looked at him. She looked at his face, which she knew the way she knew the ranch land, every line and shadow of it, familiar and still worth looking at. "You were the best part," she said. "You were the only part that surprised me, and everything I built is better because of it. Not because you built it for me, because you were beside me when I did." The night settled around them, vast and starred and silent, and Jacob brought her hand up and pressed it to his lips with the same careful tenderness he had shown her from the beginning, and the cedar hills stood against the sky, and the ranch breathed around them in the cold, and Evelyn Mercer Rhodes, who had stepped off a stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, with a broken past and a working future, and the fierce intention to make something of her own, sat in the life she had made and found it exactly, precisely. Completely enough, more than enough, everything.